In this section, I just wanted to have a quick blast down the callouts that you can use in VBScript for the data sources, just to draw your attention to some of their use. Some of these we've used in our samples, but it's worth going over them, I think. So let's start at the top. Data source execute will simply execute the data source, passing it the key values, and whatever that data source does, the results will be returned to your VBScript in a variable. So it's actually quite a useful way of setting up a data source, maybe a query. So you're not having to build vast amounts of VBScript to run a business object, run the business object query, get the data back, and then do something with it. Data source refresh sounds similar, but and does something very similar, but instead of returning data to you, it simply runs the data source and refreshes any element that's bound to that data source. So it's a good way of maybe updating a form and then refreshing the data after you've updated a form, and we use that in our little sample custom maintenance program. Data source execute SQL. This will apply to both query and transaction custom data sources, and allows you to pass a fully qualified SQL statement to the data source and say, get on and execute that. And then the return value will be the result of whatever you've issued. If it's a query, you'll get your query back. And if it's a transaction, an update or delete, you'll get number of rows affected and stuff like that. Data source execute XML doc is similar, but for a business object, transactional business object. And this is the ability to build your XML document, the data that you're giving the transaction business object in your VBScript, pass it to the data source and execute it. So you're not relying on the mapping element, you're doing it all yourself. Data source get XML document, we use that in our little inventory sample, where you can get hold of the XML document after the substitution has happened, and do something with it. And don't forget that from an event point of view, if you are firing the data source directly from a control on a toolbar, then there are two other events, and those were up here, top left, on before transaction and after transaction, where you can catch the data source executing and do something there as well. Data source validate key is really quite useful. It's a quick way of checking whether a single key exists in a table, or maybe a compound key exists in a table. So maybe, does the customer exist? Does the stock code exist? Does a salesman in this branch exist, where you need to have branch and a salesman, and so on like that. Data source setup type changing. We use this in our customer maintenance program, where we wanted to change the add to an update, and obviously it'll do for a delete as well. Data source web set URL. This is for web service data source, and you can construct your URL in your code and just give it to the data source and say, get on with that. If you are using the data source where you're actually updating data on a target machine, and you've got to pass a body of data, you can set the body of the body variable of the call to whatever you put in there. Data source set HTTP header. This is the ability for you to be able to set the HTTP headers. Remember the key value pairs I talked about? You may want to change those within code as well, and they may well have variables dependent on what the API is doing. Data source web get properties gets you an XML string with things like the URL, the method, the query strings, and so on like that. It's just a way of saying this is all the data we've got. And then finally, get the full URL. So this will allow you to see the full URL you're executing after the data source has substituted all the bits and pieces. It's quite useful as well. So overall, we think we provided all the callouts you should need to be able to manipulate the data sources in VBScript should you ever need to. And the name of the game really is to try to reduce the code as much as possible by using data sources to do the grunt work. Don't forget that they're doing it on the server for you. Then once you get the answers back into your VBScript, you're away. And that's really it for this course. It's been a bit of a long one, I know, but there's an awful lot of stuff to cover. Thanks for listening. Bye.